Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another seminar in the POMP core seminar series devoted to international relations this semester, this term, and tonight we are going to have the only session devoted to history, very recent history, but still history. So no more diplomats and no more political commentators. We have two historians actually as our speakers. Our main speaker is Dr. Christiaens, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Leuven University and a senior member of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. His research focuses on international solidarity movements, needless to say, North-South and East-West contacts. That comes out very strongly in the case of today's talk. 1968 movements, human rights history during the Cold War. He has published articles on transnational campaigns over Latin America, Vietnam, Poland, and Southern Europe, and is currently involved in a publication project on entangled transitions between Eastern and Southern Europe, 1960s, 2000s. And he also actually works on various aspects considering the role of General Pinochet and his projections in Western and Eastern Europe. So we basically have this global perspective. And Kim's discussant is going to be Professor Paul Betts, who needs no introduction here, especially that starting in January he has become the director of the European Studies Center. But Paul is a historian of modern Germany. But Paul apparently is also actually working currently on the huge research project which is called Socialism Goes Global. So this is a very nice synergy, I think, because if Kim is going to talk basically about the entanglement between solidarity movement and then various organizations in the global south mutually, Paul is basically working on how communists were trying to influence also to some extent the global south. So I think those two gentlemen actually shared a lot and have a lot of in common. The title of today's talk you can actually see here, Solidarność in the Global South during the 1980s. Kim, let's start.
Okay, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to speak here. What I am presenting is in fact a research project which started almost 2 years ago. And I'm currently carrying out this project together with Ines Baltkoderis, who couldn't unfortunately be here. And maybe before I start, it's possibly also interesting to look at the history of historical research. Ideswald, he's coming from the East, let us say. Ideswald has worked on Solidarity with Solidarity, also on the Solidarność coordinating office abroad. And I mainly started from a southern perspective. I worked on Chile, Vietnam, and Latin America. And when we started collaborating in research that aimed at untangling the history of North-South and East-West movements, we were fascinated by the many cross-references between, on the one hand, the struggle of Eastern European dissident movements and anti-colonial movements in the South. And when we were looking for answers to understand these connections, these cross-references, we were quite left hungry. And we were confronted with two conflicting narratives. A first narrative, a very potent narrative, was that of a global civil society in which Eastern Europe and Southern Europe met each other somewhere in the 1970s. It's the story of global civil society, which was very fashionable in the 1990s. It's also the story of many supporters of Solidarność who are equating the struggle against Jaruzelski with the struggle against Pinochet in Chile. And what you see is that relatively quickly in the 1980s, it became fashionable to talk about Pinochetization of Poland. Christian democratic trade unionists, observers, saw much many convergences between what happened in Poland and what was happening in Central America at that moment, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala and El Salvador. And this vision of one global civil society was also found in many studies about transition. Most of you will know, of course, Samuel Huntington's claim that something which he dubbed the third global democratization wave started somewhere in Southern Europe in the 1970s, then went to Latin America, and from Latin America went to Eastern Europe. And this is, I think, also part of a broader anti-totalitarian narration. And it has become, I think, especially in the 1970s, attractive to look at Eastern Europe from the Southern perspective. 1968 in Western Europe was called the spiritual Biafra. You also have in the 1980s, as I mentioned, the examples of activists, of dissident movements, which started to frame their struggle in Eastern Europe in the terms of Third World struggles. So all this has meant that there is an important narration that connects these struggles in imagined terms. On the other hand, the second and quite conflicting narration is that of Noam Chomsky. In 2014, at around the same time we were starting this project, Noam Chomsky provoked a controversy when stating that dissident movements were above all absorbed by themselves, lacked any connectivity with the more horrific, according to him, dramas in the global south, and were mainly concentrated on their own national, even provincial struggles in Eastern Europe. Of course, Noam Chomsky has maybe pushed the argument too far, but his vision also echoes in much of the research which has been done by people like Kenny in his Carnival of Revolution. He claimed, and I'm quoting him, that Solidarność was a strongly national embedded and introvert movement which never staged a public campaign in defense of a foreign movement. Solidarity, in sum, was slow to react to external events. Over the last past years, we have a huge amount or growing amount of scholars which are delving into this connection, and mainly Cold War historians. Cold War historians like POMP were reassessing the relationship between the Third World and Eastern Europe. Especially, I think this research line builds on what has been started by people like Otarne Westad, claiming that the Third World was an independent source, that it also exerted substantial influence on Eastern Europe. New Cold War historians are building on this argument to reassess, to review the relationship between dissident movements and the Third World. And they are charting out how the Third World influenced dissident movements. And so now we have a heated debate about the question whether we can say that North-South and East-West movements did entangle, or that they lived in separate worlds. And this is quite a complicated debate, partly because few historians have looked at beyond the imagined connections, and have really looked at the material connections, the material networks that connected Eastern European dissident movements with the global South and vice versa. And so in our research, we wanted to look at the ways in which Solidarność, being the most important dissident movement, established real contact with anti-colonial movements in the global South. And by looking at these material networks, we also want to have a new look on the entangled history in imagined terms. Our story starts somewhere in November 1980, which was a couple of months after the establishment of Solidarność. In November 1980, a first official delegation of Solidarność went abroad. And strikingly, this first international delegation did not go to Europe, did not go to the United States, but to Latin America. In November 1980, two persons, Józef Przybylski and Zygmunt Zawalski, traveled as official representatives of Solidarność to Lima, to Peru, and to Caracas. You can see both figures together with the Venezuelan president Herrera Campins. And in Peru and in Venezuela, they really organized various solidarity conferences. They attended public meetings with Christian trade unionists, with members of the local Polish community. Highly mediatized meetings took place with the leadership of the Christian democratic trade unions, and they also staged even campaigns for the collection of material support. This visit of Solidarność and the delegation it sent to Latin America was the start of a connection that would last for several years. The guest of the delegation was the Central Latinoamericano de Trabajadores, which was the central the regional confederation of Christian trade unions in Latin America. The CLAD, it's called, and the CLAD invited Solidarność delegations, new Solidarność delegations over the coming years. It also staged the first campaigns in support of Lech Walesa and also for human rights in Poland in 1980 and 1981. And the CLAD was also remarkably one of the few delegations from the Third World which attended Solidarność first and last National Congress in 1980. This liaison, this connection between Solidarność and the regional confederation of Christian democratic trade unions from Latin America is striking for a number of reasons. First of all, because the CLAD had devoted little attention in the 1960s, 1970s, even in the late 1970s, to what happened in Eastern Europe. Its leader was Emilio Maspero, which was strongly influenced by liberation theology, and which was really, so he was really speaking a language of anti-imperialism, of a new kind of socialism, and he was really seeing Christian democratic trade unions as a third way in Latin America, which went beyond the two blocs. From the late 1970s, and also due to the new Polish Pope, you see that Christian democratic trade unions are rediscovering their Christian identity. They strongly identify with John Paul II, and see this Christian identity as a means of profiling themselves against social democratic trade unions and their struggle against right-wing dictatorships, most notably in Chile, but also as a means of profiling themselves vis-à-vis Marxist opposition movements and governments, Cuba, Grenada, and, of course, Sandinista Nicaragua. So you see how the CLAD is instrumentalizing the Polish trade union movement for its own means. That's not that surprising. You also see that in many other countries. But more surprising is the interest of Solidarność in this alliance. The CLAD, after all, was a relatively small international confederation with about 2 million of affiliates, representing about 5 to 10% of Latin America's unionized workers, and it paled in size and it influenced by comparison with its much larger regional competitor, which was the Social Democratic URIT, affiliated to the Social Democratic International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. And as I mentioned already, the alliance between Latin American Christian Democrats and Solidarność is also remarkable because Solidarność had little interest in other causes in the global south. We were surprised that we checked the list of people who were attending this first National Congress of Solidarność in the autumn of 1981, and you see that the Third World is mentioned at all in this first National Congress. It isn't about the Third World, with the exception of some occasional references to the murder of Sadat in Egypt and the struggle against Pinochet. But broadly speaking, the Third World is absent, except a clad representative of Venezuela, Rafael Leon, who was one of the few non-European participants at this Congress. What explains this early alliance between Solidarność and Latin America? Key was the involvement of the World Confederation of Labor, which was the International Confederation of Christian Democratic Trade Unions. It was headed at that moment by Jan Kowakowski, who was born in Poland and moved to Belgium after the end of the Second World War. And you see that the World Confederation is at that moment in a huge identity crisis. The World Confederation of Labor, for those who don't know, was established in the 1920s as the International Federation of Christian Trade Unions, had undergone a process of deconfessionalization by changing its name to the World Confederation of Labor, but was still in an important identity crisis. Dutch and French members, Christian trade unions, have left the organization, and it was really in competition with the much larger, more influential International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, of social democratic stock. And you see that this international network of Christian democratic trade unionists within Europe looks at looks at symbols for profiling themselves in this changing international landscape of trade union movements. And they find in Solidarność an example of a curious example of a trade union which is Christian, which is Catholic, overtly Catholic, and tries to represent a third way. And they put much efforts in combining the CLAD, Latin American Trade Union Confederation, with the newly emerging trade union in Poland. And there was also, of course, a Polish interest in this connection, because it allowed people of Solidarność to profile themselves in the networks of these international Christian democratic organizations, such as the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and to receive substantial material aid from European Christian democratic movements, which were, as part of the Cold War struggle, financing Latin American trade unions over the 1970s and 1980s. These relations between Latin America and Solidarność expand after the declaration of martial law in December 1981. We see that the fate of the plight of Solidarność provoked a lot of reactions in Latin America. I won't delve into them too much, but it's important that after the events of December 1981, Solidarność is sending new delegations to Latin America and is even establishing in 1983 a branch of the Solidarność Coordinating Office abroad, which was established in 1982 as the official representation of Solidarność on the international scene, which was headquartered in Brussels. And in 1983, you see how Venezuelan and Christian democratic trade unionists from Latin America are setting up a branch of Solidarność, of the Solidarność Coordinating Office in Venezuela, in Caracas. The office was manned by Zygmunt Zawalski, which was a quite low-profile member of Solidarność, and this coordinating office was meant to strengthen solidarity campaigns in Latin America, most notably in Venezuela, with Polish solidarity. This collaboration between Solidarność and Latin American Christian trade unionists went quickly wrong. There were some important conflicts. First important conflict was the relationship with the United States. The Solidarność coordinating office abroad was headed by Jerzy Milewski, who was one of the key exiles and who was the leader of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad from 1982. And you see how the Solidarność coordinating office abroad is devoting much attention to collaboration with American trade union movements, with the AFL-CIO. Whereas the Latin American Christian trade union movements are increasingly becoming anti-American at that moment, partly due to what's happening in the Falklands. And they are really trying to denounce what they call as the Cold War language of social democratic trade unions supported by the AFL-CIO in Latin America. A second and more surprising point of divergence was the stance towards the Soviet Union. The interest of Latin American trade unionists in the Polish cause was mainly inspired by what was happening in Latin American countries such as Nicaragua. Christian democratic trade unionists were seeing Nicaragua as the poles of Latin America. And they saw much parallels between the red dictatorship of Nicaragua under the Sandinistas and the red dictatorship under Jaruzelski. Strikingly, the Polish members of the Latin American office and more broadly of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad didn't like this anti-communist stance of the CLAD. We found some letters by Zawalski, which were intercepted by the Polish secret services, in which he says that Latin Americans were not interested in the Polish case and were also completely living in a different world. We interviewed the wife of Zawalski, and she was talking about a cultural gap between Polish migrants and Polish exiles of Solidarność and Latin American trade unionism. She argued that in Latin America everything was mañana. And you see how there was really an important gap which was not visible for people outside this network, but inside this network you see that there was a lot of conflict between these Latin American Christian trade unionists and Solidarność. So after some months, after about 8 months, this Solidarność coordinating office abroad in Caracas disappears and Zawalski returns to Europe. And so here does this story of connections between Latin America and Solidarność end, at least for the case of the CLAD. You see, on the other hand, and this is the second part of this story, that Solidarność will pay much attention, or is forced to pay attention, to 3 other global causes célèbres of the 1980s. And this is what my second part will focus on, namely the relationship between Solidarność and three important causes that dominated international headlines over the 1980s simultaneously with the Polish crisis, namely the Sandinista, the cause of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the case of Pinochet in Chile, and obviously the resistance against apartheid in South Africa. To start with the first, as I mentioned briefly in the previous part, Solidarność sent various delegations to Latin America already from the early 1980s. In January 1982, as part of a broader tour in Latin America, the Solidarność delegation consisting of Tadeusz Konopka and Przybylski visited Nicaragua. They were not allowed to leave their plane and had to leave the country. They were invited by Nicaraguan trade unionists from affiliate of the CLAD, which had much attention or much interest in Solidarność. Nicaragua, since 1971 ruled by the Sandinista Liberation Front, was an important issue for many international Christian trade unionists. Nicaraguan opposition, which was mainly carried out by trade unionists, paid a lot of attention to what happened in Poland. They identified themselves as a kind of Solidarność of Latin America. They also visited the office of Solidarność in Caracas and organized many solidarity campaigns over Poland during the 1980s. And this is, of course, rooted in the similarities that existed between the situation in Poland and in Nicaragua. Both regimes were ruled by Marxist governments, which also had amicable relations. And you had the alliance between Moscow and Nicaragua. You also had the alliance between Managua and Warsaw. And so you see how these international collaboration, even if it was more complex than what we might think, stimulated the idea among Latin American trade unionists that Poland and Nicaragua were part of the broader anti-totalitarian struggle against red dictatorships. Solidarność wasn't interested in Nicaragua, however, for a number of reasons. First of all, because Nicaragua received a lot of support within Polish society. It is an aspect of what we now call socialist globalization that the Polish regime put much effort in propagating its image of international solidarity in Polish society. It propagated its solidarity with the Chilean resistance in the 1970s. Similarly, it also identified with the Sandinistas from the late 1970s. And you see how even among members of Solidarność, there existed some sympathy with the Sandinista Liberation Front. The second reason why Solidarność was very skeptical of becoming associated with the anti-Sandinista campaigns of Latin American trade unionists was, of course, the important left-wing sympathy with the Sandinistas. Günter Grass, for instance, traveled to Nicaragua, and upon his return to Europe, he claimed that Nicaragua and Sandinistas in Nicaragua and Solidarność were the same. There were similar causes, they were causes which were deeply connected. And this was, of course, important because Solidarność, of course, did not want to jeopardize this left-wing, European left-wing support and try to avoid the connection with Nicaragua. So these reasons mainly explain why Solidarność remained deeply unconnected to Nicaragua. It didn't connect to support networks in Europe for the Sandinistas, but neither side with anti-Sandinista campaigns, which were very potent in the 1980s among Christian democratic and social democratic trade unions in Europe. Nicaragua was an anathema, but Chile became, I think, the most important cause for solidarity in the 1980s. And this is also surprising, because there are many differences, of course, between Chile and the resistance against Pinochet on the one hand, and the struggle of Solidarność on the other. Chile was ruled by an explicitly anti-communist regime, Pinochet. And secondly, the resistance against Pinochet was, ever since 1973, dominated by communist and socialist exiles, which were headquartered in Berlin, in Moscow, and which identified with Allende. Allende, a martyr of socialism. So you see on the face of it that there was really a huge gap between Chile and Poland. But it was precisely this connection with the communist camp which rendered the Polish events so meaningful for many opposition movements against Pinochet in the 1970s. In the late 1970s, we see a huge divergence, huge debate among Chilean exile movements about the relationship between opposition against Pinochet and state socialism in Eastern Europe. The Chilean Socialist Party, which was the main body in exile of Chilean solidarity movements, witnessed a split between one tendency which kept to the language of armed resistance, of solidarity with the Eastern European state socialism on the one hand, and then we also have what we call renovated socialists, which were headed by Carlos Altamirano, and which were trying to present a new alliance against Pinochet, an alliance which united Christian Democrats, social democrats, in a new kind of socialism. And you see that this renovated strand within Chilean exile movements tries relatively quickly to connect to Solidarność. Already in 1981, Carlos Altamirano traveled to Warsaw to meet with Wałęsa and express solidarity with the Polish opposition, which provided the renovated Chilean socialists a projection screen for their belief in the power of democracy, non-violent resistance, and broad-based opposition. And even inside Poland, we see the interesting story of many Chilean exiles which had arrived in Poland after the coup, which are sympathizing with the Polish trade union movement, even to the point that some of them were forced to leave the country. So you see a lot of interest from the Chilean side in the case of Solidarność. And these links between Chilean opposition movements and Solidarność was not limited to the realm of discourses and imagination, but was also concrete. You see that already in the early 1980s, there emerges a potent exile connection in Brussels. Brussels, as I have said, hosted the international offices of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad. And in Brussels, you also see the emergence of a Chile Labor Committee, which was headed by Manuel Bustos. Manuel Bustos, who was one of the main trade union leaders from the Chilean opposition. In the 1980s, you see how many leading exiles, Chilean exiles, are staging in common solidarity campaigns with Polish members of the opposition. Most famously, you have the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Wałęsa in 1983. And Wałęsa invited Rodolfo Seguel, which was called the Chilean Wałęsa, to attend this event in 1983, in December 1983. In Brussels, you also see how a Chile Labour Committee was established after the example of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad. And this Chile Labour Committee, which was headed by Luis Menezes, you can see Luis Menezes on the left side and Jerzy Milewski on the right side, closely collaborated during the 1980s. They were funded by the same allies, the International Christian Trade Union Movement, the ICFTU, and the WCL. And whereas you see that Solidarność had little interest in Nicaragua, you see that they will put much effort in becoming associated with the Chilean resistance for a number of reasons. In a common interview, Milewski stressed that solidarity with the Chilean resistance had to make clear that Solidarność was anything but a matter of the right or a clerical reactionary movement, and even less a CIA plot as averred by Eastern European state propaganda and its leftist critics in the West. In his opinion, in the opinion of Milewski, connecting to Chile was important to make clear that Solidarność was part of an anti-totalitarian struggle in countries where there didn't exist a left and a right. A second element which explains this important interest of Solidarność in Chilean opposition was that it provided a kind of what Sergei Ushakin has called mimetic resistance. It offered a means for the Polish opposition to use the official discourse of solidarity with the anti-Pinochet forces as a means to attack the legitimacy of the Polish government. After years of state propaganda celebrating the need of international solidarity with the resistance against Pinochet, Solidarność could now use this discourse of the Polish government. And it tried to universalize its cause by connecting to the Chilean opposition. Thirdly, the alliance with the Chilean opposition was also important for dramatizing the mission of solidarity with Solidarność. Especially in the 1980s, when you see that many people, even many supporters of Solidarność, are tilting towards a policy of normalization towards the Jaruzelski government. Connecting to this drama of Chile, of the repression of Pinochet, is a means for the Polish opposition to cultivate this mission of solidarity with the Polish opposition. And a fourth factor that contributed to this link between Solidarność and Chile was, of course, the intermediary role played by common supporters, notably the international trade union movement, but also human rights and justice NGOs such as Amnesty International, who simultaneously denounced human rights violations in Poland and Chile, and staged meetings with representatives of the Chilean and Polish opposition at international fora. You also have, for instance, the connection by John Paul II, who visited Chile in April 1987 and ignored the official program by meeting with political opposition leaders and with representatives of all trade unions, a meeting that was entirely broadcast by the church television. So all of these elements meant that Solidarność and the Chilean labor opposition kept deep contact throughout the 1980s and regularly referred to each other. Michnik, Wałęsa, Milewski and other Solidarność leaders issued several solidarity declarations in support of the Chilean trade union movement, even if plans of Wałęsa to visit Chile were impeded by the Chilean government, which was wary of the impact this could have on fueling domestic opposition inside Chile. So, in the 1980s, you see an important common identity between Solidarność and Chile. And this contrasts with the stance of Solidarność towards a third important cause of activism during the 1980s, namely the struggle against apartheid. Apartheid, which after the Soweto uprising developed into the most important global movement of the 1980s. And you see really in the 1980s, of course, a groundswell of support for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Solidarność could obviously not ignore this, because there were many parallels between the two most mobilizing issues of the 1980s. Lech Wałęsa received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983, the black South African Bishop Desmond Tutu the subsequent year. In November 1984, Poland announced its withdrawal from the International Labour Organization following a report criticizing its policy towards Solidarność, just as South Africa had formally given up its ILO membership in 1963 in response to the allegations concerning the violation of trade union rights. You also see that many members of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad and South African trade union opposition leaders regularly met at international fora and conferences in Western European locales, brought together by their common allies. Again, mostly the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and the WECL. But this also happened on a lower scale. Tadeusz Konopka, the Solidarność representative in Italy, for instance, recalls how he was often put on the same program with ANC activists at local meetings and events. In 1999, you see this discourse, in the 1990s, you see this discourse of one common victory of apartheid, anti-apartheid, and Solidarność. The end of apartheid is seen as the same victory of a similar victory of Wałęsa in Poland. In the 1990s, former Polish dissidents such as Mikolaj were also involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And especially in the 1990s, you see how many people, such as Mikolaj, try to associate both movements. Yet, public memory seems to inappropriately bracket together Solidarność and anti-apartheid, or at least to exaggerate the real scope of their collaboration. You see, first of all, that there was not much interest in Solidarność among many South African opposition movements. You had some support, mainly among some social democratic and Christian trade unions in South Africa, but for the larger part of the South African opposition, Solidarność was anathema. Why? Of course, because of this important alliance that emerged ever since the 1960s between anti-apartheid organization in South Africa and solidarity with solidarity from Eastern Europe. You also see that Solidarność doesn't organize any solidarity campaign on behalf of anti-apartheid in the 1980s. An exception only happened in 1983, when Milewski traveled to Africa and visited Kenya and Zimbabwe and issued one important solidarity declaration in support of the anti-apartheid movement. This support of Solidarność was due to external pressure. Solidarność, until 1983, didn't declare solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. It was only forced to do this in 1983 because of one particular issue, which was the recruitment of Polish migrants by the South African apartheid regime. After the events of December 1981, you see that many Polish refugees go to Vienna and travel from Europe to work in South Africa. And the South African government even stages recruitment campaigns across various European countries and brings Polish migrants to South Africa. This was, of course, an important issue for Solidarność. It gave the impression that Solidarność allied itself with a regime which was widely condemned at that moment. In 1983, under the pressure of the international trade union movement, Milewski travels to Africa and makes one broad statement claiming that the issue of apartheid was also the concern of Solidarność. And he connected both issues in the framework of one anti-totalitarian struggle, seeing colonialism as something which was very similar to state socialism in Eastern Europe. But this reaction or this move of the Solidarność coordinating office towards support to Solidarność was largely a failure. It received a lot of criticism, also within the Polish exile communities in South Africa. And even Milewski, in his letters, was not convinced about his support or the support of Solidarność for the anti-apartheid struggle, because he saw the anti-apartheid movement as something which would lead to a communist liberation of South Africa. And so behind the scenes, Solidarność coordinating office abroad was really skeptical of the anti-apartheid movement. And so it is only in the 1990s that amnesia about these internal struggles of Solidarność, that is amnesia about this resistance of Solidarność towards South Africa, that has allowed to cherish one common identity between South Africa and the Polish opposition. In sum, I will leave it almost here. What are the main conclusions? First of all, an important conclusion is that the opportunities for connections between Solidarność and anti-colonial movements were shaped by the official discourse, state socialist discourse of international solidarity with the Third World. There is now, or there has been a tendency to poo-poo this, to say, okay, you have this official discourse of solidarity, of anti-colonial solidarity in Eastern Europe, but after all, this had an impact. Our research argues that it did have an impact. First of all, because it made that many dissident movements in Eastern Europe had no alternative or no opportunity for alternative opinion making. The knowledge on Latin America, the knowledge on South Africa within Eastern Europe was strongly influenced by these official discourses of international solidarity. And secondly, this discourse of international solidarity also influenced the position of many anti-colonial movements towards Solidarność. You see that, of course, you need two to tango, that the anti-apartheid movement, most notably the ANC, but also the South African Communist Party, didn't want to connect to Solidarność. Similarly, Sandinistas in Nicaragua had no interest in connecting to Solidarność, obviously because it would jeopardize their cooperation with the socialist world. So our paper or this presentation argues that international discourses of international state socialist solidarity did matter for the study do matter for the study of international connection between dissident movements and the global South. Secondly, the story of Latin America also points to the importance of Christian democracy. The international support for Solidarność during the 1980s has mostly focused on the United States, the AFL-CIO, and social democrats in Western Europe. And there has been given little attention to the role of Christian democracy, partly, of course, because Eastern Europe lacks an important Christian democratic tradition until today. What we say is that Christian democracy offered an alternative third way to dissident movements in the 1980s. A third way, we also associate the third way with the new left, which is somewhere between traditional social democracy and Soviet communism. This story of connections between Solidarność and Latin America shows the appeal of a Catholic identity, of Christian democratic identity, also among Eastern European dissident movements. Thirdly, we also see the gap that looms between the discourse of international solidarity, global solidarity, and the reality of contacts. The question is, should we blame Solidarność for its lack of contact with the third world? Something has to be said for this view, this negative view. On the one hand, you see that Solidarność didn't put its international collaboration high on its agenda. The contacts with Latin America were mainly carried out by rather low-profile members of the Solidarność coordinating office abroad. And of course, the contacts between Latin America and other third world movements pale by comparison with the dense networks with Western European and American social movements. But on the other hand, you also see that the opportunities for Solidarność to make connection with third world liberation movements were strongly limited, both by the official discourse of international solidarity, but also due to the barriers such as barriers raised by the regimes. Pinochet, for instance, impeded the travel of Wałęsa to Chile. Solidarność couldn't access to Nicaragua due to the refusal of the Sandinista government to allow them access in the country. So you see a complicated story in which Solidarność contacts were mainly dependent on the intermediary role of its allies in Europe and in the West. So I will leave it here. So I have passed my time, I think, with 10 minutes. But
great.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let me first of all thank Kim for the presentation, also from Mikolaj for organizing the event tonight, and to welcome our friends from Latin American Studies Center here at the college, which for tonight have co-sponsored this event. What I thought I would do is just make, in a sense, just pose a few questions. I'm going to speak for 5 minutes about some things that are raised. I mean, I think what you've done very, very well, and you're really the forefront of this kind of literature, is to kind of force us to rethink the geography of the Cold War, where decades, of course, we've in a sense understood that as a superpower conflict on an east-west axis. Now, there are always countercurrents to this story, but in the last 20 years, much more an effort to, in a sense, globalize the story of the Cold War, thinking about, let's say, the conflict between the West and the South. And there's been much more of an effort in recent years to kind of fold in the Soviet Union and most recently China, including Chinese Soviet competition, in an effort to kind of expand the story. What I think you're doing really in a very innovative way in this project is also thinking about the relationship between small states, in this case between kind of second, third world, Eastern Europe, Asia, really Latin America and Africa, in terms of how these smaller states interact. I think that's actually quite important. It gives us a very different view of how the Cold War functioned on the ground from many of these particular places. Now, With that in mind, I have a couple questions. Wonder why the story is just not very well known, because you pick up in the early slides that, for example, you have this Chomsky interview from 2014, and then you talk about Patrick Kenny. Clearly, there's a range of people in the 1980s that are making a great deal of this story. I mean, someone like Adam Michnik's a pretty good publicist, and there's a way in which people are trying to make this case very well known. How come this story disappears so quickly? I imagine, for example, when Solidarity takes political power, they would invite their colleagues in Chile as part of the kind of anti-Pinochet celebration. So in a sense, this idea of internationalizing Solidarity was there through the 80s, and then when they take power, that's quite important to, in a sense, revive those international links. Why, in a sense, in terms of for historians or for public intellectuals, why this particular traffic has dropped away so quickly, and it's your task then to help us kind of recover it. So it's really, in a sense, asking you to think about, before the Chomsky interview of 2014, what happened over the course of the 90s where the story has dropped away. Secondly, which you mentioned at the very end, you talk about the importance of Christian democracy, and you do talk about liberation theology somewhere, but it's really, in a sense, the question of the role of the churches in both cases, in the role of Catholicism in particular, must have played a role more than in this kind of politically instrumental way. But Catholicism, I imagine, was quite important for that interface between Polish solidarity and, let's say, Nicaragua and even Chile. So just in terms of reviving the place of religion as part of that particular contact. The third is the issue of diasporas. I mean, you talk about the interface between Poles and Chileans, for example, in places like Brussels. But what about the Polish community, let's say, in the United States, the Chileans that are living in Paris? I mean, how do these diasporic communities help stitch this connection together through newsletters, through contacts? What about the people that live abroad? It's a little bit like Kostas' project about the kind of the diaspora of the Greek left, in terms of how does the diasporic communities keep alive these particular international solidarities. Fourthly is the role of international organizations as a kind of another level here. You talk about the World Federation of Labor. I was thinking about the ILO, at least before 1983, as a kind of meeting point for, let's say, representatives from Chile, Nicaragua, Poland, and it gives them a place where they can kind of exchange ideas. And what about the role of these international organizations in mediating some of this contact between, let's say, Poland, Nicaragua, South Africa, and Chile? The next question is really one about, in a sense, the last question is really about earlier moments of solidarity. In a sense, it's suggesting that the 80s becomes a very important moment for this. But what about earlier historical moments in the Cold War? I was thinking, for example, of 1956, with the kind of Polish uprising, and then the Suez. I mean, are there moments then where you have a kind of Polish-Egyptian solidarity, where that's across oceans, in which they're thinking about these international causes, and are they building on those connections during the 1980s? And just in terms of thinking about this as part of a larger tradition of, in a sense, kind of Polish, in this case, kind of North African, and then later Southern African traditions. So I'll go ahead and just leave it there, but I think what you've given us is a very it's a very innovative view in terms of rethinking the Cold War. You don't have to answer these questions right away. We can also just go ahead and go to the audience, and you can fold those in, and you can answer those in kind of in a picking and choosing way, if that's probably better. But I just wanted to at least pose those, which felt to me very interesting issues that your presentation raised very beautifully.
Oh.